bond or any other security is what this chapter is going to give us regulations about. And typically, whenever we issue non-convertible securities, they come under the category of debt. And if it is debt, you will always have to appoint a debenture trustee. So in these regulations, we are mainly focusing on debt securities, non-convertible redeemable preference shares, then perpetual debt instruments, if any, issued by any company, and any non-cumulative preference shares which are also issued on a perpetual basis. Typically, these are very rare, and most investors will not invest in your company if you issue these securities. But always we do remember that any preference share also has to be redeemed within 20 or 30 years if it is issued by a company in its normal course of business, and 30 years if it is issued by an infrastructure company. All these securities, including a commercial paper, is collectively called as NCS. NCS meaning non-convertible securities. Out of those, preference shares will fetch you dividend. Debt securities will fetch you interest. Debt securities typically have a fixed maturity period. And if they are issued in securities market, they are issued by company. But if they are issued in the money market, they will be regulated not by SEBI but by Reserve Bank of India. So all these instruments are typically debt market instruments. Sometimes these instruments can also be issued through the form of a trust like a REIT or INVIT. That is Real Estate Investment Trust or Infrastructure Investment Trust. And whenever any company issues any security, the requirement always remains the same. First is draft offer document, which is nothing but draft prospectus, that you will file with SEBI. And final offer document you will file with SEBI, ROC and Stock Exchange. In addition to this, it is also important for us to remember that these companies may issue these NCS through a public issue or through a private placement, which is nothing but preferential issue. And these companies may also end up giving these securities as part of a rights issue, like we have seen before. If you do private placement under Companies Act, we always pass special resolution in case of private placement. If you're doing public or rights issue, then the board itself has the power to issue these securities. Some of these securities could be secured, some of these securities could be unsecured, but all of these securities are not convertible into equity. So these are some of the features of these NCS. Secured NCS typically have the right of what is called as charge. If a company issues an NCS, the issue differs, the security differs, and their nature differs. Issue could be public issue, could be right issue, or it could be preferential issue, which is called as private placement. Only for this we require SR. The security itself could be a perpetual preference share or a debt security or a commercial paper or a non-cumulative preference share or a debenture, which is redeemable. So we will call them as NCRPS, non-cumulative but redeemable preference share. Perpetual preference shares are only redeemed on perpetuity after the lapse of 20 or 30 years. Commercial papers are money market instruments issued by companies, so RBI comes into the picture. And you have the typical debt securities also. All of these are non-convertible securities. Their nature could be secured or unsecured. Secured securities have a special right called as charge. Charge gives the right to sell a specific asset of the company if they don't repay. If they don't repay your money, you have the right to sell a specific asset of a company. This type of charge is called as a fixed charge. If you can sell instead of specific asset, if you sell any asset of the company, that gives you what is called as a floating charge. And typically whenever there is a floating charge, they will convene a meeting to finalize out of all the assets which are said to be sold. That process is called as crystallization of the charge. And that typically is what you need to know with respect to the background of this particular chapter. If you want, you can take a screenshot of this. In addition to these scenarios, typically, what usually happens is you have the same set of prospectus and regulations under SEBI, which will be repeated afterwards. So you have the draft prospectus, which is issued first, and all of these securities will first go through SEBI and they will get approved through this draft prospectus. And then the final prospectus goes to, once again, SEBI plus ROC plus stock exchange. Those 10 defaults that we learned during the buyback chapter, they will be repeated here. That is why we did buyback chapter first, so that we can keep repeating those points for every other chapter. A company who has committed those 10 defaults cannot issue the securities under this chapter. Always resolutions are required from the board of directors, and if you're issuing obviously a preference share, you also require special resolution for those also. Whenever any of these securities are issued, typically you will require a special resolution, and you should not be, again as I said, default. You should not be debarred from accessing. Your promoters should not be debarred from accessing. You should not be a willful defaulter, should not be a fugitive economic offender, and your directors and promoters should not be a willful defaulter. These 5 points you can add to those 10 points to make a standard list of 15 points that you can write for every question which is related to issue of any security. Basically, only good companies are required to be part of capital markets. So you should not have, as a company, been debarred from accessing the capital markets, or your company cannot be a defaulter. Neither can your promoters or directors be debarred from accessing, or they can be willful defaulter. At any point of time, if you have been levied with any penalty, that penalty should also already be paid. So basically, no pending litigation for all of these companies. Just like buyback chapter, here also you will take in principle approval from the stock exchanges in which you want to list these securities. Just like that chapter, all the shares will be in demat form. And whenever you have demat shares, you have to take the help of NSDL or CDSL. One of the depositories, you have to enter into a agreement. If you are issuing securities, you appoint primary market intermediaries. If you're trading in securities, you will be dealing with secondary market intermediaries. Since this chapter, we are issuing securities, we will appoint primary market intermediaries. Those primary market intermediaries include debenture trustee. We are not issuing an equity share here, so we don't really need an underwriter. We don't really need an RTA fully, but apart from RTA, registrar is definitely required. The 5 primary market intermediaries include the merchant banker, a bank, and typically only these people were involved in ICTR. But now we will also involve debenture trustee. So appoint debenture trustee, appoint RTA, ensure that if underwriting is required by SEBI, only then you appoint underwriter. Appoint a merchant banker who will give you due diligence report, and writing one portion of underwriting will be taken care by the merchant banker. You will also have a bank where you will open the escrow account, and you also will obtain credit rating agency from at least one leading credit rating agency in India, and this will be disclosed in your prospectus. Only then people will invest in your securities. Since you are issuing non-convertible securities, you have to create some sort of a reserve. Here it is called as a recovery expense fund. This fund will be created with a stock exchange, and whatever money the stock exchange asks you to deposit in this particular fund, you will deposit that money here. All the fees will be paid in advance to SEBI and stock exchanges. And once you get the relevant resolutions, which is special resolution in these cases, you can go ahead and issue these securities. But before you do that, if you redeem these securities before maturity, so let's say I am issuing a perpetual preference share, my redemption period is 20 or 30 years. If I'm issuing a debt security, it could be 10 or 20 max. Commercial paper typically are issued for way lesser than 10 years. And NCRPS depends from company to company, but this also cannot exceed 20 to 30 years maturity. If you're issuing these securities, you have to utilize the money for so many years. But if you don't do that, then you will have to mention it in your prospectus that you have the right to recall or redeem the securities prior to their maturity period. If you include this as a clause in your prospectus, you have the right to obviously redeem the securities before maturity. No company wants to keep paying interest for 20, 30, 15 years. All companies want to raise money from the market ASAP, and then they would want to ensure that they give back your money at the earliest possible. Whenever redemption happens, redemption will always happen at a premium, and if it is at a discount, that discount will be found out by the merchant banker who helped you issue these securities. In addition to this, you also have capital redemption reserve if you issue preference shares. You have debenture redemption reserve if you issue debenture. In addition to your recovery expense fund that you have opened with the stock exchange. So whenever you issue debt and non-convertible securities, you always have to create a reserve for their redemption. This is a requirement under Companies Act. So you ensure you create that. Since you're appointing a trustee, you will have to create a trust deed also, and you have to obtain a ISIN number, International Securities Identification Number, for your non-convertible security. In the trust deed, you give powers to the debenture trustee or any other trustee that you appoint, and you will also ensure that you pay 2% interest per annum as a bare minimum till you execute this trust deed. Execution meaning, suppose you collected money from all the investors. Investors gave you the money. You started utilizing the money, but you still have not executed the trust deed. So let's say you promise to pay everybody 8% interest for these non-convertible securities. Till you execute the trust deed, you will pay them 10% interest. An extra 2% will be paid till you sign the trust deed. That is how important the appointment of a trustee is. And also make sure that the trustee signs this trust deed, and you also file form SH12 whenever you are issuing these securities. So ensure that there is no 10 defaults. Ensure that you don't have those 5 points with respect to your company or your promoter. Pass special resolutions whenever required. Appoint primary market intermediaries. Enter into trust deed. Issue prospectus or offer document properly, whether it is a draft or final. Also file form SH12. If you do all of these requirements and also obtain ISIN number and enter into agreements with your primary market intermediaries, then you pretty much are ready to issue any of these securities as non-convertible securities. Once you have issued these securities, you will have to list them. So you have to enter into a listing agreement. Companies Act wise, you also create debenture redemption reserve or capital redemption reserve. If required, you also take in principle approval from stock exchanges, and you enter into not only agreement with primary market intermediaries, you also enter into a listing agreement with the stock exchanges. So if you list them as points, the very first thing will be your resolutions, which is SR in most cases, unless you are issuing a commercial paper, then you only need board resolution in most scenarios. Ensure that even before you pass this resolution, the company has not committed 10 defaults plus 5 defaults with respect to your company and your promoter and directors. Appoint primary market intermediaries and enter into agreements with them. Get trust deed drafted, or else end up paying 2% extra interest on your securities. Create debenture redemption reserve or capital redemption reserve, whether you're issuing debentures or preference shares. Obtain in principle approval plus enter into listing agreement plus create recovery expense fund. These 3 things you will do with stock exchange. Also ensure that you have created the prospectus, which is called as offer document as per these regulations, and you have created both the draft and the final prospectus. Draft goes to SEBI, final goes to SEBI, ROC and stock exchange. This one set of rules that you are seeing can be repeated for every chapter that has any issue-based requirement. Obtain ISIN number, and that should pretty much be enough. Once these securities are issued and you have got the money, you can start utilizing it, and every year you will pay interest or dividend accordingly, depending on whichever security that you have issued. So whenever you are paying interest or whenever you're distributing dividend, before doing that, always take the approval of debenture trustee. So this is your pre-issue requirement. You also have post-issue. Once you have issued the securities, distribute dividend and interest on time and pay it only once the debenture trustee has approved the amount of interest or dividend that you're supposed to pay. Also utilize the money that you have taken as per the requirements of SEBI. Treat all the investors equally. Make sure that your shares are always listed on the stock exchange, and if some investor does any complaint, we already know that we have to follow the SEBI complaints redressal system. You resolve all their investor grievances on time. Whenever any SEBI or stock exchange authority asks information from you, provide it to them from time to time. And always have sufficient security cover, which is mentioned in your trust deed. Never have your securities at risk. That is what a company means issuer should ensure. So you can call them as issuer obligations. So issuer obligations are pre-issue and post-issue. Once company has ensured all their obligations, debenture trustee also has a few additional obligations because he is the most important intermediary for this chapter. So he should always monitor the debenture redemption reserve, the recovery expense fund, from time to time. You should always keep talking to the board of directors, and whenever required, he can appoint a nominee director in your company. That decision will be taken by the debenture trustee. Always remember that these securities are bound not only by SEBI regulations but by Companies Act. This is the common rules. Now, if you're doing a public issue, that is going to be similar to the requirements of an IPO. And public issue in this case will not be called IPO because you are not issuing equity shares, you are issuing debt securities. And if you are wanting to issue a special category of security, you have to follow additional compliances. These special category securities, which are not just NCS, they come under the category of green debt securities. These are those securities that are issued for setting up and creating renewable energy and sustainable energy projects. Any project that contributes towards environmental welfare. Any project that helps in generation of electricity using these sources. Any project that helps in transportation and transmission of this electricity and energy. Any project that helps in water management or climate change adaptation. Any project that creates green buildings, carbon neutral or carbon negative buildings, like Apple has created not only carbon neutral buildings but also carbon neutral products. If your company is helping in sustainable waste management, if your company wants to create sustainable land use projects by planting more trees through afforestation or agriculture, if your company wants to set up projects for biodiversity, for all these projects, a lot of money is required as funding. And many companies will only do this type of renewable and sustainable energy projects if they are getting extra incentive from the government. So rather than just issuing NCS, if you issue an NCS, which is going to be used for environmental projects. So an NCS whose money will be used to set up an environmental project, such a NCS will be called as green debt security. If you just use the money to expand your business, if you just use the money to set up a new branch, if you just use the money to pay off your existing loans, that and all is normal corporate use, general corporate purpose. But if you use this money to set up an environmental project, then you should be getting additional benefits from the government, right? So those securities, SEBI always categorizes as green debt security. Same draft offer document as usual. Always ensure that whatever advertisement that you're doing for green debt securities, they include additional disclosures under Schedule 5. You're not just issuing a normal security, now you're issuing a GDS, so you need additional disclosures. So whenever you're doing pre-issue advertisement, those advertisements should include certain disclosures as per these schedules. And usually advertisements go in two newspapers, one English and one regional language newspapers. All share application forms will be attached with abridged prospectus. And green debt securities can only be issued through book building process. And ICDR regulation gives us a minimum subscription of 90%. ILNS regulations and these GDS only have a minimum subscription of 70%. 5%. That's another benefit that you have by issuing these securities. And you should ensure that whatever ASBA that you are utilizing, application supported by blocked amount, which we learned in part A, during book building process, your bank account usually is blocked with the amount that you are investing in this company. That blocked amount should be unblocked within 8 days. If the minimum subscription is not received. So if minimum subscription is received, that blocked amount will now be debited from your bank account and it will be credited to the company's bank account. But if the company cannot achieve minimum subscription, you should get a refund of this money, right? But you never sent the money was only blocked. So instead of getting a refund, the money will be unblocked in 8 working days. Also, underwriter appointment, primary market intermediary appointment remains the same. And whatever allotment that you are doing, if there is a delay in allotment, you will pay an interest of 15% per annum. A due diligence certificate typically is given by merchant banker. But here, additional due diligence certificate is also given by debenture trustee. If you're issuing an equity-based security, merchant banker will give you due diligence certificate. If you're issuing a debt-based security, debenture trustee will issue this due diligence certificate typically. And their formats are also different. Apart from this, most other compliances remain the same. They have just bifurcated these into 3 different categories. They are mentioning the same point here. If you issue NCRPS, non-convertible but redeemable preference share, if you issue non-cumulative preference shares, or if you issue commercial paper, you should always ensure that investor grievances are taken care of. You list the securities on time and you allot the securities as per the timeline mentioned in your prospectus. As a CS, you should ensure that you talk to the board and advise them accordingly. You talk to all the investors and resolve their grievances. And if for some reason government ends up investing in your company, you will also have to talk to governmental authorities. And in addition, you will always talk to regulatory authorities like SEBI and stock exchanges. You are the licensing officer of the company. So ensuring that all these compliances are met is what is your role in this particular chapter. That is your NCRPS, NCS, commercial paper, and green debt securities. Green debt security utilization wise, though your chapter doesn't cover this, all these green debt securities, if you issue, banks will give you loans at a cheaper rate. And if a bank ends up issuing these securities, then they also get additional benefits from RBI under Banking Regulation Act. So that is the additional advantage of issuing these green debt securities. So very straightforward chapter. Always remember, whatever structure we learn in buyback chapter and this chapter, this is what will be repeated in the rest of the chapters if it is related to issue. Most of these points will be repeated there also. So Thursday we will start a little early